From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Please join me in welcoming Senator Kay Bailey Hutchison.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for coming out early to start getting the flavor of this wonderful treasure that the Library of Congress puts on for our country and especially our children and our book lovers. So I am so happy. This is my third presentation. As Carlos mentioned, I have written 2 books about American women trailblazers. And I think Alexis de Tocqueville started out talking about the women of America in his famous trip here in the 1700s. He said, when it gets down to the end, this is a paraphrase, when it gets down to the end, I would say the most important attribute of this great country is the superiority of their women. And he talked about that they had strong opinions and that men listened to them. So I thought that was a great beginning, knowing that those earliest women showed a spark that was different, that showed an independence and a resilience. So my first 2 books were about the American women who broke barriers in the different fields. And I was able to do the first women who made the start at getting into a field, whether it was journalism or athletics or aviation or politics or education. And then I was able to interview the women who were still breaking barriers in the same field. So as an example, in American Heroines, my first book, I wrote about Margaret Chase Smith as the earliest trailblazer and running for the Senate on her own and winning. And then I was able to interview Madeleine Albright, Condoleezza Rice, and Sandra Day O'Connor, who were still breaking barriers in the field of statesmanship and politics. So then, after my first 2 books with my wonderful publisher, HarperCollins, they said, well, you know, would you like to write another book? And then I came into the great state that I represent, Texas. And the role of women in history generally has been less on the market than the great men who have settled our nation as well as our state of Texas. And so I thought, I'm going to do something on basically 19th century Texas women. And it was for a couple of reasons. Number one, of course, you know I love my state. Number 2, though, there is something special about Texas. And I believe that spirit of Texas was created in the 19th century. And there has been a lot of talk, I know, about Texas. And as I came into the national scene in the Senate, I would see people roll their eyes when we talked about how great Texas was or how big we were or how important we were. And so I got used to that as well. And so I thought, you know, there is something different about us. Some people like it, some people really don't, but there is a spark, there is a spirit. And I wanted to continue my insistence that women be included in history by writing about this Texas spirit, because our history is different. We're the only nation that fought for our independence and became a nation. We fought for our independence from Mexico. We were part of Mexico in the early 1800s. And that revolution and the women who were there during the revolution really showed a resilience. But there was something else. With the revolution and then later the trail drives and the ranching and the settling of far west Texas, harsh land, harsh conditions, there was a spirit of really not only resilience, but a positive attitude, a happiness, a gaiety that has been passed through our generations, thank goodness, to give us a kind of a spark that I think is special. Now, I will quote from a couple of people about Texas. Someone said, yet another person has made that very tough decision when learning that their company was moving to Texas, that hard decision about whether to move or throw themselves in front of a runaway train. And then there is Molly Ivins, who was a dear friend of mine. You broke the mold after Molly Ivins, and she said, I dearly love the state of Texas, but I consider this a harmless perversion, which I only discuss with consenting adults. Well, so I know we're controversial, but I wanted to go back and look at that beginning. And in the early 1800s, it was part of Mexico, and the women who came to Texas were basically genteel Southern women. They were educated, they had refinement, they had a quality of life that was pretty good, and they married husbands who were adventurers. Now, why would men from the East Coast and the southern states that were already in the United States, why would they come to America come to Texas when it was so primitive and pretty open, pretty lawless? Well, here's why. Because back then, so many of the young men were born into families with a lot of kids, a lot of boys and girls, and so there were 10 kids, and even if they had a good life, there wasn't going to be much to be passed down. So the lure of free land is what really brought the men and the adventurers. Because if you moved to Texas back then, when they were just getting started, and they were trying to encourage people to come from America into this part of Mexico, you got free land. And as long as you would farm it and use it, you were able to keep that free land. So these Southern belles came with their hardy husbands, and what they found was stark reality. There was nothing there. There was harsh land, harsh weather, no houses whatsoever, and certainly no furniture. And so I have a couple of quotes from letters that were written and things that were said back then. Now, my great-great-grandmother was one of these Southern belles. Her father was the governor of Tennessee, and she married her young husband, who just graduated from medical school. He was setting up his medical practice, and they moved to San Augustine, Texas. Now, it was pretty primitive back then, but she wrote this letter that just touched my heart. Out in this new country, she was writing to her sister, Dear Lou, out in this new country, I see no one but strangers, but they are the kindest people I have ever met. The society is as good as in any portion of Tennessee. There seems to be as much refinement as you meet with at any place. There is no such thing as fine houses or furniture. They have very comfortable houses, but can't get furniture. We are too far from navigation to get such things. By the time we make the money, they will navigate the Sabine River. Then we can all get the little notions we fancy we need. If I had been in Tennessee, I would have thought the house we occupy would not do at all. We live in a small house with 2 rooms and a passage. It doesn't even have a plank laid overhead. But with all these inconveniences, we are getting along finely. I mean, just a positive spirit that shows in a new place where there was really nothing. Another book was written by Mary Austin Holly. Now, we're talking 1831 here. Her cousin, Stephen F. Austin, who's considered the father of Texas, was trying to encourage people to come from the East and settle. And so he encouraged his cousin to come from North Carolina and go back and write a book that would encourage people to think this was a great land of promise. And she did. She was actually taken with Texas in the time that she spent here. And this is what she wrote. It is not uncommon for ladies to mount their mustangs and hunt with their husbands, to ride long distances on horseback, to attend a ball with their silk dresses in their saddlebags. Hardy, vigorous constitutions, free spirits, and spontaneous gaiety are thus induced and continue a rich legacy to their children, who, it is to be hoped, will sufficiently value the blessing not to squander it away in their eager search for the luxuries and refinements of polite life. So you saw in 1831 that spark that said, you know, things are tough, it's hard, but they're presenting a gaiety in their society that is so exciting and so much fun. You read about, two of my chapters are about Margaret Houston and Sam Houston, because Sam Houston was the commander-in-chief of the war with Mexico for independence, and he had already been governor of Tennessee, but he left Tennessee after something happened that has never been really discovered by the historians, and that was a disastrous marriage. He married a young, beautiful girl, Eliza Allen, and something terrible happened, and it was so bad that he resigned the governorship of Tennessee and left. And he went and lived with Indians, where he had lived several times in his life and was actually a great help to him when he came to Texas and understood when there was trouble with the Indians, because, of course, when the settlers moved in, the Indians' way of life was being severely disrupted. But he understood the Indians, and he loved the Indians and considered himself an Indian in many ways. But when he came to Texas, he became an immediate hero because he did have a military background. He had fought in a war with the Indians, but he had a special character, and he is, in the lore of Texas, he's really the most famous, and he became one of the first 2 senators from Texas. But when Sam Houston came to Texas, he had this gloried past, and he married Margaret Houston, and they had so much correspondence because he was gone so much of the time. He was gone to start writing the parameters of the new Republic of Texas after he won the Battle of San Jacinto. He was part of the leadership of Texas, and then Texas became a republic, and we were a republic for 10 years, and he was one of the leaders and then became one of the first 2 senators. So he and Margaret were married, and there are 2 chapters on them because they wrote so much, which was a godsend for historians because it told about life and it told about the early struggles of Texas. But Margaret was very quiet and very shy, really, and she didn't even accompany General Houston when he became governor, and he was president of the Republic at one point. She didn't even go to Austin with him very much because she was very, very shy. But she had this same grit and determination. She was an Alabama girl, and she met Houston after he had won the Battle of San Jacinto when he was coming through Alabama and came to the home of her brother. And after she had her second child, she had a tumor in her breast, and it became very, very painful. Well, he was in Washington, and she didn't want to trouble him. And so she reached out to his best friend, Ashbel Smith, who was a Yale-educated physician who was also in the Revolution and also a great friend. And she said, I have this, I know there's something growing, it is very painful, and I feel that we need to do something about it. Well, he came to see her, and he agreed. He said, we need to do something. I'm not the best qualified, but I'm going to come back in a couple of weeks with a surgeon, and we will take this out. So she wrote Sam Houston, and she said, you know, I'm in pain. I'm going to have a little surgery. It's going to be quick. It'll take 2 minutes, and not to worry. Well, she had the operation to take out the breast tumor, and because she had been so strong with her husband Sam that he not drink, she refused to take the alcohol that Dr. Smith was urging on her to dull the pain, and she refused to take it. And Asheville Smith wrote to Sam Houston and said, she took it like a soldier. She bit on a Cohen and endured this and survived and had more children, and she had a very long and regular life. But of course, with no anesthetic, and she had that amazing resilience, just like those good girls that came in. Thomas Rusk, who was the other first senator of Texas, who was he was actually the Secretary of War. He and Sam Houston were best friends, bonded, and they were both elected by the Texas legislature to be the first senators from Texas after the 10 years of the Republic, and Texas came into the Union. Now, I'm going to digress for a moment and say that Texas did come in to the United States first under a treaty, because we were a nation, of course, and the treaty was signed, but they couldn't get the 2/3 vote in the Senate to ratify the treaty. So President Tyler said, all right, I'm going to introduce a resolution. We'll pass a law to let Texas into the United States. Well, John Quincy Adams, who had come back to the House of Representatives by then, after being president, filibustered the entry of Texas into the United States for days on end. Every day he filibustered until finally he was worn out, and at the end, Texas came into the United States by 1 vote in the House and 1 vote in the Senate. So I like to tell my friends in Texas when I'm going back, and we've had all the wars that we've been fighting in the Senate for Texas, that it's not new that they don't love us in Washington. They never have. But Thomas Rusk was the first senator along with Sam Houston. And because they were in the Revolution, I thought he wrote something in the report to the president of the new republic about the battle that again told the tale of the greatness of Texas women. He said, the men of Texas deserved much credit, but more was due the women. Armed men facing a foe could not but be brave, but the women, with their little children around them, without means of defense or power to resist, faced danger and death with unflinching courage. That's the name of the book, Unflinching Courage, because it was true that they faced the perils of settling Texas with so many obstacles. They feared that the Mexican army was coming into the east, and they fled in what was called the runaway scrape. Many of their children died. My great-great-grandmother was in the runaway scrape going toward Louisiana. All 4 of her living children died and were dead by that time. So when she came back to Nacogdoches, her husband was signing the Texas Declaration of Independence, so he wasn't even there. She was going and struggling by herself. Came back to Nacogdoches, they reunited and had 9 more children. So these hardy women did their part, and it was a life that they embraced and loved. Moving on from the Revolution, from the Republic, the next biggest challenge was the settling of the West. And that's where there was nothing, literally nothing. Now, at least in the eastern part of Texas, they had trees so they could build the log cabins and have a place with a roof over their heads. But when they got out to West Texas, there weren't very many trees. You talk about harsh land. There are places where there is just nothing but grass. There might be hills. We do have mountains out in the far west, but to actually settle in a place, these women were going out, and this is where the Indian raids became much more prominent because the Indians were being moved out of their land, and especially the Cherokees, about whom much has been written, were very, very harsh. The Comanches, not the Cherokees, actually, they were not harsh, but the Comanches were. And the Comanches they would brutalize these families that were out there basically with no means of defense. They would kill women, old people, they would kill children. One woman who was captured, and the great historian Ted Fehrenbach wrote that the ones who were killed were the lucky ones, because the ones who were captured were really terrorized. One woman wrote and lived to write about her time, and she talked about the fact that she was 18 when she was captured. She was pregnant. The Indians let her have the baby, and then they killed the baby in front of her and threw it in her lap. I mean, that was the kind of harshness that was when they started going out west. But here again, we're talking now 1850s, 60s, and 70s. The women were so resilient and amazingly so in the face of such harsh conditions. One of the women who was a settler and started also even going on the trail drives with their husbands. Now, the trail drives, once you were out in West Texas, you were raising cattle, but you had to get the cattle to market to make your money so that you could keep building. Well, the trail drives would go on these famous old historic trails like the Chisholm Trail or the Goodnight Loving Trail. Many of these trails would go on horseback, covered wagon, and the cattle would be moved on foot from Texas, sometimes South Texas, all the way to Kansas, Missouri, or Colorado. It would take months. And the women, some would dare to go with their husbands. One of those women was Eliza Bunton Johnson. Now, this was Lyndon Johnson's grandmother. I didn't know about her, although she was in the Cairo books, but I had not dwelled on that part of the Cairo, wonderful Cairo books about Lyndon Johnson. But Lucy Johnson was giving me and my children a tour of the Johnson Ranch, which is a national park and a national historic preservation area. And so Lucy was giving us a tour of the house that they had grown up in and was part of that ranch. And she talked about her great-grandmother who had been out there in Johnson County, in Johnson City and that area, and how she had survived an Indian raid in their home by hiding under the house and putting a rug over the trap door that she had gone under and putting a diaper in her baby's mouth so that the baby wouldn't cry. And she heard the Indians come in. They were throwing her china at the wall, breaking her wedding presents that were china, and she stayed down there, and then she heard them leave and take the horses outside, and then she heard footsteps back in, and her husband was crying just out loud, thinking that she had been taken or killed, and so she opened the trap door and came out. Well, Lucy told me this story, and she said, now, you know, I can't, this is what was passed down, so don't take my word for it, because I jumped on it, and I had already finished the book, but I said, oh my gosh, I mean, she should be in the book. She is exactly the kind of woman that I want to be in the book. So I went back and did verify all the things that Lucy had said, and a lot of it was in the Cairo books. And there was also a letter that wasn't in the Cairo books, but we found it in our research, that was written by one of the young cowboys that had been put on the payroll to help with the trail drive. And he wrote to his father. And this was 1871 now. And he was on a trail drive to Kansas, and he wrote to his father, "I am the hero of our camp. Riding out with Mrs. Johnson, some 8 miles in advance of the train, I shot a deer." Well, if they were 8 miles in front, that means they were the scouts, which was the most dangerous part of the trail drive. But she had done that, and she was written about in a book about the women of that era. And it said, Eliza Bunton was gently reared. She was another one of those genteel Southern women who had come from the East, but she took to the frontier life like a heroine that she was. She often saw horses dash into the pens near the house with arrows sticking in their flanks. So there was another of the great women that came forward. 2 other women in this chapter were women that presided over very famous ranches. Now, at one point, the King Ranch was the largest ranch in the world. It started in Texas with a hard-drinking ship captain, Richard King, who met this lovely Southern girl whose father was the preacher who had come into South Texas to be a preacher. And her parents were horrified that she would consider this uncouth man. But she was in love, and they got married. And, of course, her influence on Richard King was great because she stopped the harsh drinking. I can't say that she stopped it all, but she did stop enough of it to make him the productive person that he was. She refined him in many ways. But she started her life as the doyenne of the greatest ranch in the world. She started her life in a mud hut because there were no trees out there with which to build a log cabin. So she was happy in her mud hut and talked about what a wonderful honeymoon they had and the times that they were able to ride out together. That mud hut, of which there is a picture in the King Ranch archives, didn't even have room for her kitchen utensils, so they were all hung outside on the hut. But that, again, shows that great resilience of these refined women who came in and really, much through their own influence, helped shape their men into the successes that they were. I end the book with the transition to the 20th century with another woman that I revere, who did so much to blaze the trail for women, and that is Ovida Culp-Hobby. She was born in 1905, but she was the woman who actually started the wax at the request of General George Marshall when the war was just heating up in the late 30s, early 1941. George Marshall said to her, because she had been volunteering in the run-up to the war, he said, "I want you to give me the things that women can do that will take the men and put them in combat, and we can have the desk jobs done by the women and let them be a part of this effort." She loved that. She drew up the things that she said that the women could do, which were 236 functions, and then she gave him a list of the people that she thought that she had worked with that would be qualified to form this great WAC, which is Women's Auxiliary Corps, and Women's Auxiliary Army Corps then. And she gave him all of this. And George Marshall said, "No, I want you." She said, "Oh, no. I live in Houston. I have husband and children in Houston. Not me." And then Marshall talked to her husband, who had been the former governor, and he said, her governor husband said, "Of course you're going to serve your country when you are asked." And so she did, and she put the wax together, and they were an incredible success. What she said was that with all of the things, not she, but Douglas MacArthur once said, "The wax are my best soldiers, more industrious and better disciplined than the men." And they became so successful that in the end, they had hundreds of other responsibilities because they had done such a great job at the ones that had been started. So that was the transition. Now, I have about 10 minutes left, I was just told, and I would love to take your questions because this is something that is dear to my heart. I'm so pleased that I have been able to share with you some of the things about the great women that have really helped shape America, that was recognized as early as the 1700s by Alexis de Tocqueville as the specialness that gave America the advantage that we have. Thank you.
Hello. Oh,
You
can
have a
I just
question?
start? I have a question.
Okay. Yes.
That was wonderful. Thank you. Do you feel if there are more women in Congress now, we would have a little more productivity?
I have to say that my experience in working with my women colleagues has shown that we do find a way to go forward with wins on both sides and make progress for our country. I have to say that. I have been chairman and ranking member of the different committees with Dianne Feinstein, with Barbara Mikulski, and we have a way of getting down to business, kind of like Douglas MacArthur said. We are organized. We kind of say, okay, here's where I am. You tell me where you are. And then it's not that we compromise principles. We stand for our principles, but we're able to move forward and do so many important things by allowing the basics of negotiation, which are that both sides can win something and move an agenda forward. And then you have the people to decide if you were going in the right direction, because thank heavens we have great elections that give the people the chance to say yes or no.
Governor Hogg had a couple of daughters, and I was wondering, excuse me, what their contribution to Texas was.
Did you say Governor Hobby?
Hogg.
Governor Hall?
H-O-G-G.
Oh, Governor Hogg, I'm sorry. He had actually one, Ima Hogg, who did give a great contribution to our state. He was the governor of Texas, and Ima has given so much to the history and culture of our state. The home that she had in Houston is called Bio Bend, and it is a house for the treasures of beautiful furniture and artwork that she preserved through the years and then donated to the people of Texas, the people of Houston and the people of Texas, and it's one of the finest furniture collections probably in the world. And it's open for tours. It has beautiful grounds right in the center of Houston, and it's a park as well as a beautiful mansion with very refined furniture. So Ima Hogg, there were rumors that he had two daughters. It was kind of a joke that there was an Ima and a Ura, but that it was actually one great daughter, Ima Hogg.
Hello. So thank you. And to the point about the women congressional members, I actually read 9 women and 9 and counting to my Girl Scout troop back a long time ago. So, but my question is, it sounds like in this book you're focused a great deal on women who have a connection to the leaders of the state. Do you have any reflections of some of the lesser known, like maybe Suzanna Dickinson? Or
yes, she's in the book.
Okay,
yes,
okay.
Absolutely. I have a number of the lesser known women whose stories had not been told before. The women who went on the trail drives, the first woman known to have had a baby on a trail drive. Suzanna Dickinson, who was the woman who was at the Alamo, who told the most accurate history of what actually happened during the fight at the Alamo. She survived and did tell her stories. Jane Long, who's called the Mother of Texas, who had her travails. I do. But let me say about 9 and counting. Actually, the first book, not counting my 3. But the reason that I met my publisher was 9 and Counting was a book written by the 9 women of the Senate at the time. And it came from a meeting we had with the women of Northern Ireland, who at the time Northern Ireland was still having terrible murders and assassinations. They were fighting. And we had the women who came from both sides of the Northern Ireland factions, and they came and they wanted to meet with the women senators. And we did. We met with them, and we each told our stories to try to encourage them that they could be a force for peace, because we all overcame obstacles. And we talked to them about the obstacles that we had overcome, but we also talked about the divergence of our backgrounds. We had conservative Republicans like me. We had liberal Democrats like the other women of the Senate. We had such diversity in our way of being elected, but we all had obstacles. We all knew how to work together. And when we came together in the Senate, we made a difference because the men listened to us on women's health care, on the things that we knew we had credibility on. And every time the women of the Senate, the Violence Against Women Act, not one woman voted against the Violence Against Women Act. Republicans and Democrats came together. There were some compromises to try to make sure that it was the right law, doing the right things. But when we came together, we passed legislation, and we talked about that to these Irish women, these Northern Irish women, and that was the first book, 9 and Counting, and we even had a sequel to it after others came into the Senate. Hillary Clinton was elected, and of course, there was so much interest in her, so we had a sequel to 9 and Counting. And we donated, the one organization that we could agree was important for us to donate all of the proceeds was the Girl Scouts. And so they started a leadership group that was from the proceeds of that book. Yes.
First of all, thank you for your wonderful series of books documenting the history of women. And I know that you're a strong supporter of getting a National Women's History Museum here in Washington near the mall.
Yes.
And my question is, what do you think the chances are of ever getting approval through Congress to buy the land? And there is no funding required. It's just approval to buy the land.
I think we will. The Women's Museum should be a part of the history of this country. That's something, I have to say, Cokie Roberts has been another woman that has written about those great women of the past. And it's not that we're, denigrating what the men did. Oh my gosh, they're so brave, and they were so hardy, and they were visionary to write our Constitution and our Declaration of Independence. It's just that there was an impact of our women, and to make sure that that's in the annals of our history, and to show the young people about overcoming obstacles and what the women did to make sure that there was an equal voice. Because, if you look at the world, the countries that have the lowest economies are the countries that do not include the women in the economy. It's an issue for children and for families that women have the ability to be a part of society, to be the professionals that can teach our children, that can treat our people in medicine, that have so much to offer. And because of the input of women, the product is better. And it's proven if you look at the global economies of the countries that do have women in equal parts in our society versus those who don't. So yes, I think we will get it. Meryl Streep has been one of the leading lights of that movement to have a women's museum. Yeah. And my colleagues, Barbara Mikulski, Susan Collins, all of the women senators are supportive of this. And it is something that will happen, just like the right to vote, but it will be done with a positive effort. We're not mad, we're not down, we're not morose, but we are going to keep going with a positive attitude, which has been the mark of women on America. Oh, okay.
Can I have a quick...
Is that the end? Oh. Can I do one more? Okay. No. That was my last time. So thank you all so much. It was great to be with you. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.